Welcome back to our channel, History Addicted. This video is the second part about the collapse of Soviet Union. If you haven't watched the first part yet, you can find the link on the top right corner. So, let's jump right in. Nationalism and ethnic tensions. Nationalism and ethnic tensions were significant factors in the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a multinational state composed of various ethnic groups, and the policies of Russification and centralization led to tensions and a sense of resentment among non-Russian nationalities. Under Soviet rule, there was an emphasis on promoting Russian language, culture, and traditions throughout the diverse republics. This policy, known as Russification, aimed to create a unified Soviet identity but often resulted in the suppression of local languages, cultures, and national identities. Non-Russian nationalities felt marginalized and saw their distinct identities being threatened. As the Soviet Union faced political and economic challenges in the 1980s, nationalist movements began to emerge across different republics. These movements sought to assert the rights of their respective ethnic groups and to gain greater autonomy or even independence from the Soviet state. The rise of nationalism reflected a desire among various ethnic groups to protect and promote their own unique cultures and identities. The Baltic states, including Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were at the forefront of these nationalist movements. These republics, which had been annexed by the Soviet Union during World War II, sought to regain their independence. The Baltic independence movements gained significant traction and international support, highlighting the desire for self-determination among these nations. Ethnic tensions were also prominent in other parts of the Soviet Union. For example, in Central Asia and the Caucasus, there were simmering tensions between different ethnic groups. The policies of forced migration and population resettlement conducted under Stalin's regime had resulted in ethnic imbalances and territorial disputes. These tensions resurfaced in the late Soviet period, contributing to calls for autonomy or independence by various ethnic groups. The rise of nationalist movements and the demand for self-determination were fueled by a desire for cultural preservation, political representation, and economic autonomy. Non-Russian nationalities sought to reclaim their cultural heritage, gain control over local resources, and exercise more decision-making power within their territories. The Soviet government's response to these nationalist movements varied. While some republics experienced a degree of liberalization and limited devolution of power, others faced repression and military intervention. In some instances, clashes between nationalist movements and Soviet authorities resulted in violent conflicts, exacerbating tensions and widening the rift between the central government and the republics. The nationalist sentiments and demands for independence eventually contributed to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The Baltic states, in particular, successfully regained their independence and became sovereign nations once again. Other republics followed suit, leading to the formal dissolution of the USSR in December 1991. In conclusion, nationalism and ethnic tensions played a significant role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. The policies of Russification and centralization, coupled with the desire among non-Russian nationalities to assert their cultural identities and gain autonomy, fueled nationalist movements across the republics. These movements, driven by aspirations for self-determination, challenged the unity of the Soviet state and ultimately contributed to its disintegration. Reform attempts and unintended consequences. The reform attempts made in the Soviet Union, particularly under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, had unintended consequences that significantly contributed to the collapse of the USSR. Gorbachev's policies of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, aimed to address systemic issues and revitalize the Soviet system, but they inadvertently unleashed forces that destabilized the country. Perestroika aimed to reform the Soviet economy by introducing limited market-oriented measures, allowing for greater decentralization and encouraging private enterprise. The goal was to increase efficiency, productivity, and innovation. However, the implementation of these reforms was plagued by inconsistency, bureaucratic resistance, and a lack of clear direction. One of the unintended consequences of perestroika was the exacerbation of economic difficulties. As state control over the economy loosened, inflation soared, and shortages of goods persisted. The transition from a centrally planned economy to a more market-oriented system proved challenging and disruptive. The lack of a well-defined roadmap for economic reform, coupled with resistance from vested interests, hindered the effective implementation of necessary changes. Glasnost, which aimed to promote openness, transparency, and public participation in political and social affairs, also had unintended consequences. The policy led to the lifting of censorship and greater freedom of expression. While it provided an opportunity for open discussions and the exposure of long-suppressed information, it also brought to light the extent of corruption, inefficiencies, and abuses within the Soviet system. The revelations further eroded public trust in the government and the Communist Party. The unintended consequence of glasnost was the unleashing of pent-up frustrations and grievances. As the population became more aware of the shortcomings of the Soviet regime, there was an increase in public dissent and demands for change. The newfound freedom of expression gave rise to widespread criticism of the government and calls for greater democracy, human rights, and political reforms. These unintended consequences of reform efforts created a challenging and volatile environment. The combination of economic difficulties, increased social awareness, and growing demands for change placed significant pressure on the Soviet leadership. The political system, unprepared for the scale and intensity of the challenges, struggled to adapt and respond effectively. The unintended consequences also manifested in the form of increased nationalist movements and demands for independence. The relaxation of central control and the exposure of historical grievances fueled aspirations for self-determination among various ethnic groups and republics. The newfound openness allowed for the re-emergence of suppressed national identities, and calls for greater autonomy or independence gained momentum. The unintended consequences of reform attempts weakened the authority and legitimacy of the Soviet government. Gorbachev's reforms faced resistance from conservative elements within the Communist Party, who were opposed to change. The lack of unified support for the reforms, combined with their inconsistent implementation, further undermined the credibility of the Soviet leadership. The unintended consequences of perestroika and glasnost ultimately contributed to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. The economic difficulties, social unrest, nationalist aspirations, and political uncertainty that arose during this period created a climate of instability and fragmentation. The inability of the Soviet leadership to effectively manage and control these unintended consequences resulted in the dissolution of the USSR in 1991. In conclusion, the reform attempts in the Soviet Union, particularly perestroika and glasnost, had unintended consequences that played a significant role in the collapse of the USSR. Economic difficulties, increased social awareness, demands for change, the resurgence of national identities, and political instability all emerged as unintended outcomes of these reform efforts. The inability of the Soviet leadership to manage and control these consequences ultimately led to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a complex and multifaceted event. Economic decline, political stagnation, nationalism, and reform attempts all intertwined to bring an end to the Soviet era. The consequences of this collapse reverberated worldwide, reshaping global politics and ushering in a new era. It serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of economic stability, political adaptability, and addressing the diverse needs of a nation. Thank you for joining us on this historical journey. Remember to like and subscribe to our channel for more captivating videos. Until next time, keep exploring the fascinating tapestry of human history.